The crack of gunfire sent dust spiraling into the air as Rosalie Zachary bolted across the open plain, her heart hammering against her ribcage. The setting sun cast long shadows across the Wyoming landscape as she desperately searched for anywhere to hide. Her once fine dress was torn and mudded, her dark hair falling loose from its pins as she ran for her life, the distant shouts of her pursuers growing fainter as darkness fell. It was 1887, and Rosalie had never imagined her life would come to this, running from the law for a crime she didn't commit, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small satchel containing all that remained of her former life. The distant silhouette of a homestead appeared on the horizon, and with her strength waning, she made for it with renewed desperation. Blake O'Malley wiped sweat from his brow as he hammered the final nail into the fence post. At 30 years old, he had spent the last decade building his ranch outside of Cody, Wyoming, from nothing but determination and calloused hands. The last rays of sunlight stretched across his property as he gathered his tools, ready to retire for the evening. As he walked toward his modest cabin, a movement near his shed caught his eye. Someone or something had slipped inside. In these parts, a man had to be cautious. Blake set down his toolbox and reached for the revolver holstered at his hip. With measured steps, he approached the shed, listening for any sound that might reveal the intruder's identity. "Whoever's in there, you best come out," he called, his voice firm but not threatening. "I'm armed and not fond of trespassers." Silence answered him, but Blake's instincts told him someone was there, listening, waiting. With one swift motion, he pulled the door open, revolver raised. Huddled in the corner among farming tools and burlap sacks, a woman stared up at him with wide, terrified eyes. Her clothes were torn, her face smudged with dirt, but even in the dim light, Blake could see she was beautiful and absolutely terrified. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Please don't turn me in." Blake lowered his gun slightly, confused. "Turn you in? Who are you running from, miss?" "The sheriff," she answered, her eyes darting to the door behind him as if expecting men with badges to appear at any moment. "But I swear to you I'm innocent." Blake hesitated, his mind racing. Harboring a fugitive was dangerous business, but something in the woman's desperate eyes made him pause. "I'm Rosalie Zachary," she continued, her voice barely audible. "And if you help me, I swear I'll explain everything." Before Blake could respond, the distant sound of hoofbeats reached them. Rosalie's face went pale. "They're coming," she whispered. "Please." In that moment, Blake made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He extended his hand to her. "I'm Blake O'Malley. Come with me." He led her quickly to his cabin, ushering her inside just as the riders crested the hill in the distance. As Blake closed the door behind them, Rosalie stood in the center of his modest home, trembling. "There's a cellar under the rug," he said, moving to pull back a worn area rug revealing a trapdoor. "Get down there and stay quiet. I'll handle them." Rosalie descended into the darkness without question, and Blake closed the trapdoor, replacing the rug just as a sharp knock sounded at the door. Taking a deep breath, he opened it to find Sheriff Thomas Ellis and 2 deputies on his porch. "Evening, Blake," the sheriff said, his eyes scanning past the rancher into the cabin. "Sorry to bother you so late." "No bother, Sheriff. What brings you out this way?" "We're looking for a woman," Ellis said, his hand resting casually on his holstered gun. "Rosalie Zachary. Killed her husband back in Sheridan 2 days ago. Witnesses saw someone matching her description heading this direction." Blake's expression remained neutral despite the shock that ran through him. A murderer! The frightened woman hiding in his cellar didn't strike him as capable of such violence, but he'd been fooled before. "Haven't seen anyone," Blake replied with a shrug. "Been mending fences all day." Nobody's passed through that I noticed. The sheriff studied Blake's face carefully. Mind if we take a look around? She's dangerous, Blake. Stabbed her husband while he slept, according to the housekeeper. Blake hesitated only a moment before nodding. Help yourself. Not much to see. The deputies searched the cabin thoroughly while Blake stood by the door, his heart racing beneath his calm exterior. When they reached for the rug, he forced himself to remain still, but one of the men was distracted by a noise outside, and they moved on without discovering the trapdoor beneath. "What about the shed?" Ellis asked. "Just tools and feed," Blake answered. "But you're welcome to look." The search of the outbuildings yielded nothing, and eventually the sheriff tipped his hat. "If you see her, send word immediately. Don't approach her yourself." "Will do, Sheriff," Blake assured him, walking the men to their horses. "Good luck with your search." Only after the riders had disappeared into the darkness did Blake return to the cabin and pull back the rug, lifting the trapdoor. "They're gone," he said, helping Rosalie climb out of the cellar. In the lamplight, her face was even more beautiful, despite the fear and exhaustion etched into her features. "They said you killed your husband," Blake said quietly, keeping a safe distance between them. Rosalie's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't," she whispered. "I swear on my life, I didn't kill Richard." Blake gestured to a chair at his small table. "Then you better tell me what happened, because I just lied to the sheriff for you, and I need to know if I'm going to regret it." Rosalie sank into the chair, her hands trembling as she pushed her tangled hair from her face. "It was the housekeeper, Martha Sims," she began, her voice steadying as she spoke. "She and Richard, they were having an affair, had been for months." Blake listened silently as Rosalie told her story, how she had discovered the affair, how she had confronted her husband, and how she had planned to leave him the following morning. But that night, she'd been awakened by a scream, only to find Richard dead in his study, stabbed with a letter opener, and Martha standing over him with blood on her hands. "She screamed that I had done it," Rosalie continued, tears streaming down her face. "She'd planned it all. When the sheriff arrived, he found me holding the letter opener. I'd pulled it out, thinking I could save him. Martha had Richard's blood on her hands but claimed she'd tried to help him after finding him. The sheriff believed her because she wasn't the one planning to leave," Blake finished for her. Rosalie nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks. "I ran. I knew no one would believe me over Martha. Richard was from one of the wealthiest families in Sheridan, and Martha had been with them for 20 years. I'm just the wife he brought home from Boston 2 years ago." Blake poured her a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove, adding a splash of whiskey. "Drink this," he said, setting it before her. "Then keep talking. I need to know everything if I'm going to help you." "Why would you help me?" Rosalie asked, looking up at him with confusion. "You don't know me." Blake sat across from her, considering the question. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be wrongfully accused," he finally answered. "And I don't think a guilty woman would have hidden in my shed when she could have stolen a horse and kept running." For the first time, a flicker of hope crossed Rosalie's face. "There is evidence," she said, taking a sip of the coffee and wincing at the strength of it. "Martha kept letters. Richard wrote to her, arranging their meetings. I found one once, but Richard caught me with it and burned it, but there must be more." Blake nodded slowly, thinking. "And these letters would be where? In Martha's room at the house, I imagine. Or perhaps Richard kept some in his study." "That's back in Sheridan," Blake said, frowning. "That's nearly 100 miles from here." "I know it's impossible," Rosalie said, her shoulders slumping. "I should leave. I've already put you in danger by being here." Blake studied her for a long moment. At 28, Rosalie Zachary was clearly educated and refined, not the type to survive long on the run in the wilderness. But there was a determination in her eyes that spoke of inner strength. "You'll stay here tonight," he decided. "We'll figure out what to do in the morning. I've got a spare room you can use. It's not much, but it's clean." Relief washed over Rosalie's face. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how I'll ever repay this kindness." "Let's start by proving you're innocent," Blake replied. "Then we can talk about repayment." That night, as Blake lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, he wondered what madness had possessed him to harbor a woman accused of murder. Yet something in Rosalie's story rang true, and Blake O'Malley had learned to trust his instincts. They had saved his life more than once during his years drifting through the territories before settling in Wyoming. In the room across the hall, Rosalie wrapped herself in the clean blankets Blake had provided, overwhelmed by the events that had brought her to this stranger's home. For the first time in days, she felt a glimmer of hope. Someone believed her. Someone was willing to help. As exhaustion finally claimed her, Rosalie's last thought was of the tall, quiet rancher with kind eyes who had taken a chance on her when no one else would. Morning brought clarity and with it, a plan. Blake found Rosalie already awake, wearing one of his shirts with the sleeves rolled up, her torn dress hanging to dry after she'd washed it. "I hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the shirt. "Mine was." "It's fine," Blake interrupted, uncomfortable with the sight of her in his clothing but unwilling to say so. "I've been thinking about your situation. We need evidence, like you said." Rosalie nodded, gathering her damp hair over one shoulder. "The letters would be enough, but getting to them." "I can't go to Sheridan," Blake said, pouring himself coffee. "Too many people know me there, but I know someone who can help us, an old friend who owes me a favor." Hope sparked in Rosalie's eyes. "Who?" "Robert Walsh. He runs a saloon in Buffalo about halfway to Sheridan. He's got connections and doesn't ask too many questions." Blake paused, considering his next words carefully. "It's dangerous, though. You'd have to stay here while I ride to Buffalo." "No," Rosalie said firmly. "I can't ask you to risk yourself while I hide, besides if the sheriff returns." Blake frowned, knowing she was right. If Ellis came back with a larger search party, they might find the cellar. And leaving Rosalie alone on the property was risky for other reasons. She didn't know how to handle herself in the wilderness, and predators, both animal and human, were a constant threat. "All right," he conceded, "but we'll need to disguise you, and you'll need to be able to ride." A small smile touched Rosalie's lips. "I grew up riding in Boston. It's one of the few skills my husband found useful in me." Blake raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Good. We'll leave at nightfall. Less chance of being spotted that way." The day passed in careful preparation. Blake gathered supplies while Rosalie, wearing trousers and a shirt from Blake's wardrobe that hung comically large on her slender frame, helped as best she could. Blake found himself watching her as she worked, struck by her determination and the grace with which she adapted to circumstances that would have broken many women of her upbringing. "Why did you marry him?" Blake asked suddenly as they packed saddlebags in the late afternoon. "Your husband, I mean." Rosalie's hand stilled. "Richard was charming, wealthy, and my parents approved," she answered after a moment. "I was young and thought love would grow with time." Her eyes met Blake's. "It didn't." Blake nodded, understanding more than she knew. "We should cut your hair," he said, changing the subject. "With the right clothes and shorter hair, you could pass for a young man from a distance." Rosalie touched her long, dark hair hesitantly, then squared her shoulders. "Do it," she said. "Whatever it takes." As the sun set, Blake carefully trimmed Rosalie's hair to just below her ears. The transformation was remarkable. With her hair short and wearing his old clothes, she could indeed pass for a young man, at least to anyone not looking too closely. Under the cover of darkness, they set out, Rosalie riding a gentle mare named Daisy while Blake led the way on his stallion, thunder. The night was clear, stars scattered across the vast Wyoming sky like diamonds on black velvet. Despite the danger of their situation, Rosalie found herself breathing easier than she had in months. "How long have you lived here?" she asked as they rode side by side, keeping to a steady pace that would preserve the horse's strength for the long journey. 10 years, Blake replied, his eyes scanning the horizon constantly for any sign of other riders. "Came out here when I was 20, looking for a fresh start." "From what?" Blake's silence stretched so long that Rosalie thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "I was accused of something I didn't do back in Missouri, a robbery that turned deadly. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, with the wrong people. By the time the truth came out, I'd already been run out of town with a price on my head." Rosalie studied his profile in the moonlight. "Is that why you believed me? Because you know what it's like?" Blake nodded. "Partly, but mostly because your eyes tell the truth, even when you're scared." They rode in companionable silence after that, stopping only briefly to rest the horses before continuing toward Buffalo. By dawn, they had covered nearly 30 miles, and Blake led them to a small creek surrounded by cottonwood trees where they could rest during the daylight hours. "We'll stay here until dusk," he said, helping Rosalie dismount. Her legs trembled from the long ride, but she didn't complain. "There's enough cover to hide the horses, and we can catch a few hours' sleep." Rosalie sank gratefully onto a fallen log while Blake tended to the horses. The morning air was cool, a welcome relief after the night's ride. As she watched Blake move with quiet efficiency, Rosalie found herself wondering about the life he had built here alone. It seemed, with no wife or family that she could discern. "Are you hungry?" he asked, returning with a small pack of provisions. "Starving," Rosalie admitted with a smile that transformed her face, making her look younger and carefree despite their circumstances. Blake found himself smiling back as he handed her jerky and hardtack. "It's not much," he apologized. "It's perfect," she replied, taking the food gratefully. "Thank you, Blake, for everything." They ate in silence, the gentle sound of the creek and the occasional birdsong the only interruption. Afterward, Blake showed Rosalie how to spread a bedroll under the trees, far enough from the water to avoid insects but close enough to hear if anyone approached. "Get some sleep," he advised, settling himself against a tree trunk a respectable distance away. "We've got another long night ahead." Despite her exhaustion, Rosalie found it difficult to sleep with the sun filtering through the leaves above her. Instead, she watched Blake, whose eyes had closed almost immediately, his breathing deep and even. In sleep, the hard lines of his face softened, revealing a handsome man beneath the weathered exterior. Rosalie wondered what his life had been like before Wyoming, before the false accusations that had driven him west. He had mentioned Missouri but offered little else. Unlike Richard, who had spoken endlessly of himself and his accomplishments, Blake O'Malley seemed content to keep his thoughts private. Eventually, fatigue overcame curiosity and Rosalie drifted into a light sleep, her dreams filled with running horses and a tall figure who offered his hand in the darkness. She woke to Blake gently shaking her shoulder, the sun low in the western sky. "Time to move," he said quietly. "We should reach Buffalo by midnight if we keep a steady pace." They ate quickly, packed their meager camp, and continued their journey as twilight descended. The terrain grew more rugged as they approached Buffalo, the path winding through rocky foothills that forced them to slow their pace. "Tell me about this friend of yours," Rosalie said as they navigated a particularly steep section. "The one who owes you a favor." Blake's expression softened slightly. "Robert's a good man, despite his choice of profession. We met when I first came west." He was in trouble with some gamblers who claimed he cheated them. I helped him out of a tight spot. You fought for him." "Something like that," Blake replied with a half-smile. "Let's just say those men thought twice about accusing someone of cheating without proof after that night." Rosalie studied him with new appreciation. "You don't seem like the fighting type." "I'm not," Blake agreed. "But I believe in standing up for what's right, even when it's dangerous, especially then." The words hung between them, an unspoken acknowledgement of what he was doing for her, now standing up for what he believed was right, despite the risk to himself. As Blake had predicted, they reached the outskirts of Buffalo just before midnight. The small town was mostly dark, with only the saloons and gaming houses still showing lights in their windows. Blake led them down side streets, avoiding the main thoroughfare, until they reached a two-story building with a sign reading "The Silver Dollar." "Wait here," Blake instructed, tying the horses in a shadowy alley beside the saloon. "Keep your hat low and don't speak to anyone." Rosalie nodded, pulling the wide-brimmed hat Blake had given her lower over her face as she leaned against the wall, attempting to appear casual despite her racing heart. Blake entered the saloon through a side door, and Rosalie was left alone in the alley, listening to the muffled sounds of piano music and laughter from within. Minutes stretched endlessly, and she found herself growing increasingly anxious. What if Robert refused to help? What if someone in the saloon recognized Blake and connected him to her? Just as these fears threatened to overwhelm her, the door opened, and Blake emerged with another man, tall and lean, with a carefully trimmed beard and intelligent eyes that assessed Rosalie quickly. "So this is the fugitive," Robert said, his voice low but not unkind. "Come inside, both of you. We'll use the back stairs." They followed Robert through a narrow hallway and up a flight of stairs to a comfortable living quarters above the saloon. Once the door was locked behind them, Robert turned to Rosalie with a curious expression. "Blake tells me you're innocent of killing your husband," he said without preamble. "I'm inclined to believe him because Blake O'Malley doesn't vouch for just anyone, but I need to hear it from you." Rosalie removed her hat, meeting Robert's gaze directly. "I didn't kill my husband, though I can't say I mourned him deeply," she said honestly. "But I won't hang for a crime I didn't commit." Robert nodded slowly, a smile spreading across his face. "Fair enough. Blake also tells me there might be evidence in Sheridan that could clear your name. Letters between your husband and the real killer." "Yes," Rosalie confirmed. "Martha Sims, our housekeeper. She and Richard were lovers. The letters would prove it." "And why would that help you?" "Because Martha claimed I killed Richard out of jealousy when I discovered their affair," Rosalie explained. "But the letters would show they had been involved for months, and that I knew about it. I had confronted Richard weeks before his death and told him I was leaving. I had no reason to kill him." Robert exchanged a glance with Blake before nodding again. "I have a man who makes regular trips to Sheridan, Curtis Powell. He delivers whiskey to the hotels and saloons there. He could look for these letters, but he'd need to know exactly where to find them." Hope surged in Rosalie's chest. "Martha keeps everything of importance in a wooden box beneath her bed. As for Richard's study, there's a false bottom in the right-hand drawer of his desk. He kept private papers there." "Curtis leaves tomorrow afternoon," Robert said, moving to a sideboard to pour 3 glasses of whiskey. "That gives us time to plan. In the meantime, you two should rest. I have a spare room you can use." He handed glasses to Blake and Rosalie, raising his own. "To justice," he said, "however we can find it." They drank, the whiskey burning a path down Rosalie's throat, but she welcomed the warmth it spread through her tired body. "The room's through there," Robert said, gesturing to a door off the main living area. "There's only one bed, but it's clean, and I can bring extra blankets if you need them." Blake and Rosalie exchanged an awkward glance. They had traveled together and camped together, but the prospect of sharing a room and possibly a bed was entirely different. "I'll take the floor," Blake said quickly, sensing Rosalie's discomfort. Robert raised an eyebrow but didn't comment as he fetched extra blankets and a pillow. "I'll leave you to sort out the arrangements," he said with a knowing smile. "Curtis will be here at noon tomorrow. Try to get some sleep until then." When he had gone, Blake and Rosalie stood in uncomfortable silence, neither looking directly at the other. "You should take the bed," Blake said finally. "You need the rest more than I do." Rosalie wanted to argue, to insist that he had done enough for her already, but exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. "Thank you," she said simply, retreating to the bedroom. The room was small but comfortable, with a brass bed covered in a patchwork quilt and a small window overlooking the quiet street below. Rosalie removed her boots and outer clothes, slipping beneath the quilt in her undergarments. She listened as Blake arranged his makeshift bed on the floor of the main room, feeling a strange mixture of gratitude and something else she couldn't quite name. Despite her fatigue, sleep eluded her. Her mind raced with thoughts of the coming day, of Curtis Powell, and whether he would be able to find the evidence they needed. And beneath these practical concerns lay deeper questions about the man who had risked everything to help her, a stranger who had no reason to believe her story, but had done so anyway. In the main room, Blake lay awake as well, staring at the ceiling and wondering what madness had led him to involve himself in Rosalie Zachary's problems. He had spent years building a quiet, solitary life, free from complications. Yet in the span of 2 days, he had lied to the sheriff, left his ranch unattended, and ridden across half the territory with a fugitive, all for a woman with sad eyes and a story that might or might not be true. But as he closed his eyes, Blake knew he would do it all again. There was something about Rosalie that called to him, something beyond her beauty or her plight. Perhaps it was the courage she showed in the face of overwhelming odds, or the dignity with which she endured hardships that would have broken lesser spirits. Whatever it was, Blake O'Malley was committed now. He would see this through, for better or worse. Morning brought the sounds of the saloon being prepared for the day's business, chairs being moved, floors being swept, bottles clinking as inventory was taken. Blake rose early, folding the blankets Robert had provided before checking on Rosalie, who still slept soundly in the bedroom. He found Robert in the saloon below, directing a young man who was stocking the bar. "Coffee's on the stove upstairs," Robert said when he spotted Blake. "And there's bread and preserves if you're hungry." "Thanks," Blake replied, lowering his voice. "How well do you know this Curtis fellow? Can he be trusted?" Robert's expression turned serious. "Curtis has helped me with sensitive matters before. He's discreet and reliable." "But Blake, if these letters exist and they implicate the Zachary family in a scandal, there could be trouble. Richard Zachary's father has influence with the territorial governor." Blake nodded, having expected as much. "All the more reason to find them. The truth is our only defense." "And if the truth isn't enough," Robert asked quietly, Blake's jaw tightened, "then we'll figure something else out. Rosalie deserves a chance at justice." Robert studied his friend's face for a moment before smiling slightly. "You care about her," he observed. "More than just helping an innocent person." "I barely know her," Blake protested, though he felt heat rising in his cheeks. "And yet you're here, risking everything," Robert pointed out. "I haven't seen you take an interest in anyone since Sarah." Blake's expression hardened at the mention of the name. "This is different." "I hope so," Robert said, clapping Blake on the shoulder, "for both your sakes." Upstairs, Blake found Rosalie awake and dressed. her short hair combed neatly, making her look strikingly different from the frightened woman he had found in his shed. In the daylight, with rest and a chance to clean up, her natural beauty shone through the masculine disguise. "Good morning," she said, offering a tentative smile. "I hope you were able to sleep despite the floor." "I've slept in worse places," Blake assured her, pouring them both coffee. "Robert says Curtis will be here at noon. We should use the time to prepare what you'll tell him about the letters." They spent the morning going over every detail Rosalie could remember about the layout of the Zachary house, Martha's room, and Richard's study. Blake drew rough sketches based on her descriptions, marking the locations where the letters might be hidden. "Curtis will need to be careful," Rosalie warned. "Martha rarely leaves the house, and Richard's father likely has the study under guard since his son's death. Robert says Curtis has ways of getting into places unseen," Blake replied. "He makes deliveries to the kitchens of most of the important houses in Sheridan. No one pays much attention to the whiskey man." As noon approached, Rosalie grew increasingly anxious, pacing the small apartment while Blake watched her with concern. What if the letters aren't there? She asked suddenly, stopping by the window. What if Martha destroyed them? Blake rose from his chair to stand beside her, close enough to offer comfort but not so close as to make her uncomfortable. "Then we'll find another way to prove your innocence. One step at a time, Rosalie." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why are you doing this, Blake, really? You could have turned me in or simply let me go on my way. Instead, you're risking everything." Blake considered the question, knowing he owed her an honest answer. "Because 10 years ago, when I was accused of something I didn't do, no one believed me," he said quietly. "No one stood up for me or helped me find the truth. I had to run just like you. I don't want that life for you, Rosalie. Always looking over your shoulder, never able to trust anyone or put down roots." Rosalie's expression softened, and she placed a hand on his arm. "Thank you," she whispered. The moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Robert entered, followed by a lean, weathered man with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Curtis Powell," the man introduced himself with a brief nod. "Robert tells me you need something retrieved from the Zachary house in Sheridan." Rosalie straightened, dropping her hand from Blake's arm. "Yes, Mr. Powell. Letters that could prove I didn't kill my husband." Curtis's expression revealed nothing as he listened to Rosalie explain the situation and show him the sketches she and Blake had prepared. "I make my regular delivery to the Zachary house tomorrow morning," he said when she had finished. "The cook, Mrs. Hollingsworth, has a weakness for gossip and brandy. I can usually get 10 minutes alone in the kitchen while she samples my newest offering." "Will that be enough time?" Blake asked. Curtis smiled thinly. "For the housekeeper's room, yes. The study might be trickier, especially if it's being watched, but I've never met a locked door I couldn't open." "The letters in Martha's room would be enough," Rosalie assured him. They would show her relationship with Richard and give her a motive for the murder. Curtis nodded, folding the sketches and tucking them into his vest pocket. "I'll return in 3 days either way. If the letters exist and I can get to them, I'll have them. If not, at least you'll know." "What's your price?" Blake asked bluntly. Curtis glanced at Robert, then back to Blake. "Robert cleared my debt to some rather unpleasant men last year. Consider this partial repayment." He tipped his hat to Rosalie. "Good day, madam, or should I say, sir?" After Curtis left, Robert outlined the plan for the next 3 days. "You'll stay here," he told them. "It's safer than trying to find other accommodations. Blake, you can help behind the bar if anyone asks why you're here, and Rosalie should stay upstairs out of sight." "I can help too," Rosalie offered. "I'm not afraid of work." Robert assessed her for a moment before nodding. We can always use help with the books and inventory. Just keep your disguise on and speak as little as possible." The next 3 days passed in an agony of waiting. Blake worked in the saloon, serving drinks and keeping his ears open for any news about the manhunt for Rosalie. Occasionally, he caught glimpses of her moving between the storeroom and Robert's office, always careful to keep her hat low and her movements purposeful. In the evenings, they would retire to the apartment above the saloon, sharing quiet meals with Robert and discussing contingency plans if Curtis failed to find the letters. Blake found himself looking forward to these moments, the three of them talking freely, Rosalie's intelligence and wit emerging as she grew more comfortable in their company. On the third day, as evening approached with no sign of Curtis, the atmosphere in the apartment grew tense. Rosalie had barely touched her dinner, and Blake found himself watching the street below with increasing frequency. "He'll come," Robert assured them. "Curtis is methodical. He won't rush back if it means risking being followed." Just as night fell, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Robert answered it to find Curtis standing there, his expression unreadable. "Well?" Blake demanded as soon as the door was closed. Curtis reached into his coat and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "3 letters," he said, handing them to Rosalie. "From Richard Zachary to Martha Sims, hidden exactly where you said they would be. Very passionate correspondence, I must say." Rosalie's hands trembled as she unwrapped the bundle and scanned the first letter. "This is Richard's handwriting," she confirmed, her voice thick with emotion. "Dated 6 months ago, arranging a meeting while I was visiting my parents in Boston." She read portions aloud, her face flushing at the intimate details Richard had shared with his lover. The letters left no doubt about the nature of their relationship or its duration. "There's more," Curtis said, producing a small notebook from his pocket. "I found this in the false bottom of the desk. It appears to be some kind of diary or record of their meetings. The last entry is dated the day before Richard Zachary died." Rosalie took the notebook with shaking hands, flipping through the pages until she reached the final entry. Her face paled as she read. "He was planning to leave me," she whispered. "For Martha. He writes that he told her he would divorce me and marry her, but she was impatient. She wanted him to." Her voice faltered. Blake took the notebook from her, reading the passage himself. "She wanted him to get rid of you permanently," he finished for her, anger rising in his chest. "To stage an accident. Richard refused," Rosalie continued, regaining her composure. "He writes that he told Martha he wouldn't harm me, that divorce was the only option. They argued about it. And the next day he was dead," Robert said grimly. "Killed by the woman who thought he wasn't moving quickly enough to remove you from the picture." Curtis cleared his throat. "There's more news from Sheridan. The sheriff there is beginning to have doubts about your guilt, Mrs. Zachary. The Zachary family's cook came forward 2 days ago, saying she overheard Martha and Richard arguing violently the night he died." Hope flared in Rosalie's eyes. "Mrs. Hollingsworth. She's speaking up for me." "Apparently she never believed you capable of the murder," Curtis confirmed. "She was afraid to speak up at first, fearing she would lose her position, but her conscience got the better of her." "These letters and the notebook, combined with the cook's testimony, might be enough to clear your name," Robert said thoughtfully. "But getting them to the right people without revealing how they were obtained." "I'll take them," Blake said decisively. "To Sheriff Ellis in Cody. He's a fair man, and he has connections to the territorial marshal's office. If anyone can handle this properly, he can." Rosalie looked at him in alarm. "But you'd be admitting you lied to him, that you harbored me." "I'll deal with the consequences," Blake replied simply. "It's the right thing to do." That night, as they prepared for the journey back to Cody the following morning, Blake and Rosalie found themselves alone in the apartment, Robert having gone downstairs to close the saloon. "I can't let you risk yourself for me any further," Rosalie said, pacing the small sitting room. "You've done enough, Blake, more than enough." Blake watched her from his chair by the window. "It's not just for you," he said quietly. "It's for justice, and maybe a bit for myself too." Rosalie stopped pacing to look at him questioningly. "When I ran from Missouri, I never had the chance to clear my name," he explained. "I just disappeared, letting everyone believe I was guilty. I've regretted that ever since. I'm not going to let you make the same mistake." "What happened in Missouri?" Rosalie asked gently, sitting across from him. "You've never told me the full story." Blake was silent for a long moment, staring out the window at the stars. "I was 20, he began, working at a bank in Springfield. I was seeing a girl named Sarah Blackwell, the daughter of the bank's owner. I thought we were in love." He paused, the memory clearly painful. "What I didn't know was that Sarah was also involved with a man named James Roper, a gambler with debts to some dangerous people. They planned to rob the bank, and Sarah used me to get information about the guard schedules, the vault combination." "She betrayed you," Rosalie said softly. Blake nodded. "The night of the robbery, she asked me to meet her at the bank after hours. When I arrived, Roper and 2 other men were already there, holding the night guard at gunpoint. They had forced him to open the vault. When they saw me, Roper panicked and shot the guard. They tried to force me to help them empty the vault, but I refused. There was a struggle, and I was knocked unconscious. And they framed you for the robbery and murder," Rosalie guessed. "Sarah testified that I had planned the whole thing, that I had recruited Roper because I needed money to marry her," Blake confirmed, his voice bitter. "By the time I regained consciousness, Roper and the others had escaped with the money, and I was in jail awaiting trial for murder." "How did you escape?" A sad smile crossed Blake's face. "A deputy named Miller. He had known me since I was a boy, couldn't believe I was capable of such violence. He left the cell door unlocked one night and looked the other way. I ran west and never stopped until I reached Wyoming. And Sarah, Roper was killed in a gambling dispute in Kansas City a year later. The truth about the robbery came out then, but I was already gone, with a new name and a new life." Blake's eyes met Rosalie's. "Sarah married a businessman in St. Louis. She never faced any consequences for her part in it." Rosalie moved to kneel beside his chair, taking his hand in hers. "I'm so sorry, Blake. What a terrible betrayal." Blake looked down at their joined hands, feeling a warmth spreading through him at her touch. "It taught me to be careful about who I trust," he said. "But it also taught me the importance of standing up for the truth, no matter the cost." "Is Blake O'Malley your real name?" Rosalie asked suddenly. He hesitated before answering. "No, my name was Benjamin Oakes. Blake O'Malley was a friend who died on the trail west. I took his name when I settled here." "Benjamin," Rosalie said softly, testing the name. "It suits you." "I haven't been Benjamin in a long time," he replied. "But sometimes I miss him." Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, an understanding, a recognition of kindred spirits. Both had been betrayed by those they trusted. Both had lost their former lives, and both now stood at a crossroads. Rosalie rose slowly, still holding his hand. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that I will never forget what you've done for me," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "You restored my faith in humanity, Blake O'Malley, or Benjamin Oakes, whichever you choose to be." Before he could respond, the door opened and Robert entered, breaking the moment between them. But as Rosalie released his hand and moved away, Blake felt the impression of her touch lingering, warming him in a way he hadn't experienced in years. The journey back to Cody began at dawn the next morning. Robert provided fresh horses and supplies, embracing both Blake and Rosalie before they departed. "Be careful," he warned. "Ellis is a reasonable man, but he doesn't like being lied to, and the Zachary family has long arms. They may not take kindly to their dirty laundry being aired." "We'll be careful," Blake promised, mounting Thunder while Rosalie settled onto her mare. "Thank you for everything, Robert." "Just make it right," Robert replied with a nod, "and then come back for a proper celebration." They rode out of Buffalo as the sun crested the eastern mountains, taking a more direct route than their previous journey. Blake hoped to reach Cody by nightfall, pushing the horses harder than he would have preferred. "What will you do if this works?" Blake asked as they stopped briefly to rest the horses at midday. "If your name is cleared," Rosalie considered the question, her shortened hair ruffling in the breeze. "I haven't thought that far ahead," she admitted. "Return to Boston, perhaps. My parents are there." Blake nodded, ignoring the unexpected pang he felt at the thought of her leaving Wyoming. "You'd be safer there." "Safety isn't everything," Rosalie said, meeting his eyes. "Sometimes it's worth risking safety for something more meaningful." Before Blake could ask what she meant, a distant sound caught his attention: hoofbeats, approaching rapidly from the direction they had come. "Someone's following us," he said, tension coursing through him. "Get on your horse. Now." They mounted quickly, urging their tired horses into a gallop across the open plain. Blake led them toward a line of rocky hills where they might find cover, but their pursuers were gaining ground. Glancing back, Blake counted 3 riders, all armed. "Faster," he called to Rosalie, drawing his revolver. They reached the hills just as a shot rang out, the bullet whizzing past Blake's shoulder. He returned fire, aiming not to kill but to slow their pursuers. "There," Rosalie called, pointing to a narrow pass between 2 large rock formations. "We can lose them in there." Blake nodded, following her lead. The pass was barely wide enough for their horses, winding between towering rocks that provided cover from the gunfire. Behind them, their pursuers were forced to dismount and follow on foot, giving Blake and Rosalie a precious lead. The pass opened onto a small hidden valley with a stream running through it. Dense trees offered further concealment, and Blake guided them into the thickest part of the grove. "We'll have to leave the horses," he said as they dismounted. "They're too easy to spot." Rosalie hesitated. "Who are they? Sheriff Ellis?" Blake shook his head. "Not the sheriff style. My guess is they're connected to the Zachary family. Someone in Sheridan must have noticed Curtis asking questions or taking the letters." "Richard's father," Rosalie whispered, fear evident in her voice. "Edmund Zachary would do anything to protect the family name. If he knew we had evidence of Richard's affair with the housekeeper, he'd want it destroyed," Blake finished grimly. "And us with it." They secured the horses and moved deeper into the trees, Blake leading the way with his revolver ready. The letters and notebook were safely tucked inside Blake's coat, close to his chest. "There's a cave system in these hills," Blake said quietly as they picked their way through the undergrowth. "I've used it before when caught in bad weather. If we can reach it, we might be able to hide until dark, then continue to Cody on foot." The sounds of pursuit grew louder, men calling to each other as they searched the valley. Blake and Rosalie moved as quietly as possible, staying low and using the trees for cover. They had nearly reached the hillside where the cave entrance was located when a voice called out from behind them. "That's far enough, O'Malley." Blake turned slowly to find 2 men standing 20 yards away, rifles aimed at his chest. He recognized one of them, a ranch hand who occasionally worked for the Zachary family. "Jackson," Blake acknowledged calmly, keeping his body positioned to shield Rosalie. "This doesn't concern you." "Mr. Zachary says different," the man replied. Says you're helping his son's killer escape justice. Says you stole private papers from his house. Mrs. Zachary is innocent, Blake said, his voice steady. And those papers prove it. Martha Sims killed Richard, not his wife. Jackson's expression remained impassive. Not my concern who did what. I'm just here to bring the woman back to Sheridan and collect those papers. Mr. Zachary will sort it out from there. Blake heard the unspoken threat in the man's words. Edmund Zachary had no intention of letting the truth come to light. If Rosalie returned to Sheridan in these men's custody, she would likely never stand trial, and accident would ensure her silence permanently. I can't let that happen, Blake said, his grip tightening on his revolver. Don't be stupid, O'Malley, Jackson warned. There's 2 of us and more coming. You can't win this. As if to emphasize his point, a 3rd man emerged from the trees behind them, cutting off their route to the caves. Blake assessed their situation quickly. They were outnumbered and outgunned, with nowhere to run. Fighting would likely get them both killed. Yet surrender meant certain death for Rosalie. In that moment of indecision, Rosalie acted. With a swift movement, she drew the small derringer Robert had given her from her boot and fired at the man behind them. The shot went wide, but the surprise gave Blake the distraction he needed. He fired twice in rapid succession, hitting Jackson in the shoulder and the other man in the leg. As both men fell, Blake grabbed Rosalie's hand and ran for the hillside, zigzagging to avoid the wild shots fired after them. They reached the narrow opening of the cave just as more gunfire erupted from the valley below. Inside, the darkness was complete, forcing them to feel their way along the rough stone walls. Keep going, Blake urged, his hand firm around Rosalie's. There's a chamber about 50 yards in where we can rest. They moved deeper into the cave, the sounds of pursuit fading behind them. When they reached the wider chamber Blake had mentioned, they stopped, both breathing heavily from exertion and fear. Are you hurt? Blake asked, his hands finding Rosalie's shoulders in the darkness. No, she replied, her voice remarkably steady. You? I'm fine, he assured her, though in truth a bullet had grazed his side during their escape. He could feel the warm wetness of blood but didn't want to worry her. We'll wait here until nightfall, then try to reach Cody. Rosalie's hand found his in the darkness, squeezing gently. I'm sorry I've brought you into this danger, she whispered. Blake returned the pressure of her fingers. I chose this path, Rosalie. I chose to believe you, to help you. I don't regret it. In the absolute darkness of the cave, they sat close together, their shoulders touching for comfort as they listened for any sound of their pursuers finding the entrance. Hours passed, and gradually, Blake's tension began to ease. The wound in his side had stopped bleeding and the cave remained undiscovered. Tell me about your ranch, Rosalie said softly, breaking the long silence. What's it like? Blake smiled in the darkness, grateful for the distraction. It's not much compared to what you're used to, he began. Just 160 acres with a small herd of cattle and a few horses. But the land is good water year-round from the creek, enough grass for grazing. The cabin needs work, but it's solid. It sounds wonderful, Rosalie said, and Blake could hear the sincerity in her voice. Peaceful. It is, he agreed. Especially in the spring when the wildflowers bloom across the meadow and the new calves are finding their legs, or in the fall when the aspens turn gold against the blue sky. Do you ever get lonely? Rosalie asked, her voice quieter now. Blake was silent for a moment, considering the question. Sometimes, he admitted, winters are the worst, long nights with just the fire for company. I was lonely in my marriage, Rosalie confessed. Richard was rarely home, and when he was, we had little to say to each other. I think that's why I accepted the situation. For so long loneliness had become familiar. Blake's hand found hers again in the darkness. "You deserve better than familiar loneliness, Rosalie." Her fingers tightened around his. "So do you, Blake." The air between them charged with unspoken feelings, a connection that had been building since the night he found her hiding in his shed. In the protective darkness of the cave, with danger still lurking outside, Blake found himself drawing closer to her, guided by the warmth of her presence. "Rosalie," he whispered, her name a question and a promise. "Yes," she answered, understanding what he asked. Their lips met softly, tentatively at first, then with growing certainty. Blake's arms encircled her, drawing her against him as the kiss deepened. Years of loneliness dissolving in the heat of their embrace. When they finally parted, both breathing quickly, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected this," he admitted. "Never thought I would feel this way again." "Nor I," Rosalie whispered. "But I'm grateful for it, whatever happens next." They held each other in the darkness, finding comfort and hope in their newfound connection. Eventually, Blake felt Rosalie's breathing slow as she drifted into sleep, her head resting against his shoulder. Despite the danger that still threatened them, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. As night fell, Blake gently woke Rosalie. "It's time," he said, helping her to her feet. "We need to move while it's dark." They navigated carefully out of the cave, Blake leading the way with his hand on the rough stone wall. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars speckling the vast Wyoming sky. There was no sign of their pursuers in the immediate vicinity. "The horses are gone," Blake noted as they reached the spot where they had left them. "We'll have to continue on foot." "How far to Cody?" Rosalie asked, pulling her coat tighter against the chill. "About 15 miles, Blake estimated, orientating himself by the stars. "If we walk all night, we can reach it by morning." They set out across the moonlit landscape, keeping to the shadows where possible and moving with quiet determination. Blake's side throbbed where the bullet had grazed him, but he ignored the pain, focusing instead on the path ahead and the woman beside him. They had covered perhaps 5 miles when the sound of hoofbeats reached them once more. Blake pulled Rosalie into the shelter of a rock outcropping, his arm protectively around her shoulders as they watched riders approach along the trail ahead. "Sheriff's posse," Blake whispered, recognizing the lead rider as Sheriff Ellis. "They must be searching for us too." Rosalie tensed beside him. "What do we do? If they arrest me, Edmund Zachary's men could still get to me before the truth comes out." Blake considered their options quickly. Ellis was a fair man, but he was bound by the law. If he found them, he would have to take Rosalie into custody on the outstanding warrant for her arrest. "We need to reach Cody," Blake decided. "Present the evidence to Ellis on our terms with witnesses present." They waited until the posse had passed, then continued their journey, pushing themselves to move faster despite their exhaustion. The night grew colder and Blake noticed Rosalie shivering despite her heavy coat. "Here," he said, removing his own coat and draping it over her shoulders. "Take this." "You'll freeze," she protested. "I'm used to the cold," he insisted. "And we need to keep moving. That will warm me up." Dawn was breaking as they finally spotted the town of Cody in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys as the community began to stir. They paused on a ridge overlooking the settlement. "We need a plan," Rosalie said, her face pale with fatigue. "Where do we go first?" "The newspaper office," Blake decided. "Nate Wilson is the editor. He's honest and not afraid to print the truth, even when it's inconvenient for powerful men. If we can get him to publish the story, with copies of the letters as proof, it will be harder for Edmund Zachary to bury it." They skirted the outskirts of town, avoiding the main streets where they might be recognized. The newspaper office was a small building near the center of Cody, its windows already lit despite the early hour. Blake knocked on the back door, praying that Nate would be alone. After a moment, the door opened to reveal a man in his 40s with ink-stained fingers and sharp, intelligent eyes that widened in surprise at the sight of his visitors. "Blake O'Malley," Nate said, glancing past him to Rosalie. "And unless I'm mistaken, the woman the sheriff's been hunting for murder. You'd better come inside before someone sees you." Once inside the cluttered office, Blake quickly explained their situation, showing Nate the letters and the notebook they had obtained from the Zachary house. "This is dynamite," Nate murmured as he read through the material. "If what these letters suggest is true, Martha Sims had both motive and opportunity to kill Richard Zachary, and his father is now trying to cover it up to avoid scandal." "Exactly," Blake confirmed. "But there are men after us, Edmund Zachary's men, who want these letters destroyed and Rosalie silenced permanently." Nate's expression grew serious. "This goes beyond a murder case. This is about corruption at the highest levels of Wyoming society. The Zacharys practically own Sheridan and have friends in the territorial government." "Will you help us?" Rosalie asked, her exhaustion evident in her voice but her eyes still determined. Nate nodded without hesitation. "I'll need an hour to set the type and print a special edition. In the meantime, you should go to Sheriff Ellis. With these letters and my promise to publish, he'll have to take your case seriously." "Edmund's men may already be in town," Blake warned, "if they find us before Ellis does." "My brother runs the hotel across the street," Nate said, moving to his desk and scribbling a note. "Give him this. He'll let you use the back room to clean up, and I'll send word to Ellis to meet you there." Blake took the note gratefully. "Thank you, Nate. I won't forget this." "Just promise me an exclusive on your story when this is all over," Nate replied with a wry smile. "Now go, quickly. Use the back alleys." They slipped out of the newspaper office and made their way to the Cody Hotel, keeping to the shadows. Nate's brother, a burly man named George, read the note with raised eyebrows but asked no questions as he led them to a small room behind the kitchen. "There's water and soap," he said, gesturing to a basin in the corner. "And I'll bring some food. Sheriff Ellis should be here within the hour." When he had gone, Rosalie sank onto a chair, the weight of their journey finally catching up with her. "Do you really think this will work?" she asked, her voice small. Blake knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Yes," he said firmly. "The truth is on our side, Rosalie. And now we have allies to help us bring it to light." She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "And after, if my name is cleared—" "That will be your choice," Blake replied, though his heart raced at the question. "You could return to Boston, start fresh." Rosalie's eyes met his, a small smile touching her lips. "Or," Blake took a deep breath, "or you could stay in Wyoming with me, if that's something you might want." Her smile widened, her hands tightening around his. "I think I might want that very much, Blake O'Malley." Their moment was interrupted by George returning with a tray of food and the news that Sheriff Ellis was on his way. They ate quickly. Then Blake insisted on examining the wound in Rosalie's leg, where a bullet had grazed her during their escape from the cave. She had hidden the injury from him, just as he had concealed his own wound. "We're quite a pair," Blake said with a gentle smile as he helped her clean and bandage the shallow cut. "Both too stubborn to admit when we're hurt." "Perhaps that's why we understand each other so well," Rosalie replied, her hand coming to rest on his cheek. A knock at the door announced Sheriff Ellis's arrival. Blake opened it to find the lawman standing there, his expression stern but not hostile. "Blake," he acknowledged with a nod. "I've been looking for you." His eyes moved to Rosalie. "And for you, Mrs. Zachary." "Sheriff," Rosalie replied, rising to her feet despite her exhaustion. "Thank you for coming." Ellis entered the room, closing the door behind him. "Nate Wilson says you have evidence that might change the way I see this situation," he said without preamble. "I'm listening." Blake handed him the letters and notebook. These prove that Martha Sims, the Zachary housekeeper, was having an affair with Richard. They also show that she wanted him to get rid of his wife permanently, but he refused. The day after he wrote that entry, he was dead. Ellis read through the materials carefully, his expression revealing nothing. When he had finished, he looked up at Rosalie. "This casts considerable doubt on your guilt, Mrs. Zachary," he admitted, "but it's not definitive proof of your innocence." "There's more," Blake said. "The Zachary family cook has come forward in Sheridan, saying she overheard Martha and Richard arguing violently the night of his death. And Edmund Zachary has sent men after us, not lawmen, but hired guns to retrieve these letters and silence Rosalie." Ellis's eyebrows rose at this. "That's a serious accusation against a powerful man, Blake." "It's the truth," Blake insisted. "They ambushed us in the hills yesterday." "I can show you where." The sheriff studied them both for a long moment before sighing heavily. "I believe you," he said finally. "Both of you. I've had my doubts about this case from the beginning. It never sat right with me that a woman like you would suddenly murder her husband in cold blood, Mrs. Zachary. And I know Blake O'Malley well enough to know he wouldn't risk his reputation and freedom for someone he didn't truly believe was innocent." Relief washed over Rosalie, and she swayed slightly on her feet. Blake's arm came around her waist, supporting her. "What happens now?" Blake asked. "I'll wire the sheriff in Sheridan with what we've learned," Ellis replied. "And I'll keep you both in protective custody until this is sorted out. Blake, that means you're temporarily a deputy." Blake's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "A deputy?" Ellis smiled slightly. "It's the only way I can legally allow you to remain armed and with Mrs. Zachary at all times. I have a feeling Edmund Zachary's men won't give up easily, and my regular deputies have their hands full with a bank robbery in Medici." "Thank you, Sheriff," Rosalie said gratefully. "For believing us." Ellis's expression softened. "Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Zachary. We still have a long road ahead to clear your name officially. But having Nate Wilson's newspaper publish these letters will help. The truth has a way of prevailing when enough people know it." As the sheriff had predicted, the following days were challenging. Edmund Zachary arrived in Cody himself, accompanied by lawyers and influential friends, all demanding Rosalie's immediate return to Sheridan for trial. But Nate Wilson had kept his promise, publishing the letters and Richard's notebook entries in a special edition of the newspaper that circulated throughout the territory. Public opinion, which had initially condemned Rosalie as a cold-blooded murderess, began to shift. More witnesses came forward, servants from the Zachary household who had observed Martha's obsession with Richard, neighbors who had seen her entering and leaving the house at unusual hours, even a jeweler who testified that Richard had purchased an expensive locket for Martha just weeks before his death. The territorial marshal arrived from Cheyenne to oversee the increasingly complex case. After reviewing all the evidence, he ordered Martha Sims arrested and transported to Cody for questioning. Edmund Zachary's attempts to interfere were met with firm resistance from both Sheriff Ellis and the marshal. Through it all, Blake remained at Rosalie's side, his temporary deputy's badge giving him the authority to protect her from those who still wished her harm. They stayed in a small room above the sheriff's office, their forced proximity bringing them closer with each passing day. "What will you do when this is over?" Blake asked one evening as they sat by the window, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. "When your name is cleared and you're truly free." Rosalie's hand found his, their fingers intertwining with familiar ease. "I've been thinking about that," she said softly. "I could return to Boston, try to rebuild my life there, but everything I've found worth having is here in Wyoming." Blake's heart quickened at her words. "On a small ranch outside of Cody?" he asked, his voice low and hopeful. "With a man who believed me when no one else would," she confirmed, her eyes meeting his. "If he'll have me." Blake brought their joined hands to his lips, kissing her fingers gently. "He would be honored," he murmured. "But are you sure, Rosalie? Ranch life is hard, especially for someone raised in comfort as you were." Rosalie's free hand came to rest against his cheek. "The past weeks have taught me that comfort means nothing without happiness," she said. "And happiness, for me, is wherever you are, Blake O'Malley." Their lips met in a tender kiss that held the promise of all they hoped for, a future together, built on truth and trust. 2 weeks later, Martha Sims confessed to the murder of Richard Zachary. Faced with the mounting evidence against her, and abandoned by Edmund Zachary, who had returned to Sheridan to salvage his family's reputation, Martha finally broke down under questioning from the marshal. She admitted that she had killed Richard in a rage when he refused to arrange an accident for his wife. The argument in his study had escalated, and Martha had grabbed the letter opener from his desk, stabbing him repeatedly in her fury. With Martha's confession, all charges against Rosalie were dropped. The territorial marshal personally apologized for the ordeal she had endured, and even Edmund Zachary was forced to issue a public statement acknowledging her innocence. Free at last, Rosalie and Blake stood on the porch of the sheriff's office, the future stretching before them like the vast Wyoming plains. "Ready to go home?" Blake asked, offering his arm. Rosalie's smile was radiant as she took it. "Yes," she said simply. "Home." They rode out of Cody side by side, heading for Blake's ranch with lighter hearts than either had known in years. The journey was peaceful, the spring sunshine warming the land around them as new grass emerged from the soil and wildflowers dotted the meadows. As they crested the final hill and Blake's modest cabin came into view, Rosalie felt a surge of emotion. This place, which she had first seen as a desperate fugitive, now represented everything she had come to value: honesty, simplicity, and the love of a good man. "It needs work," Blake said, misinterpreting her silence as she surveyed the property. "The roof leaks in the bedroom corner and the porch steps are rotting, but with time it's perfect," Rosalie interrupted, her eyes shining with tears of happiness. "Absolutely perfect." They dismounted and Blake led her to the porch, pausing before they reached the door. With a sudden movement, he swept her into his arms. "What are you doing?" Rosalie laughed, her arms encircling his neck. "Carrying you across the threshold," he answered with a smile. "It seems fitting, considering how you first arrived here." "Hiding in your shed, terrified and desperate," she teased. "Finding your way to me," he corrected gently, "and changing both our lives forever." As Blake carried her into the cabin that would become their home, Rosalie knew with absolute certainty that she had found where she belonged. Not in the grand houses of Boston or the wealthy mansions of Sheridan, but here, in this simple dwelling built by the hands of the man she loved. In the years that followed, Blake and Rosalie transformed the small ranch into a thriving operation. Rosalie's education and head for business complemented Blake's practical knowledge of the land and animals. Together, they expanded the herd, improved the breeding stock, and built a reputation for quality that spread throughout the territory. They married that summer in a simple ceremony attended by their newfound friends Sheriff Ellis, Nate Wilson and his brother George, Robert Walsh, who traveled from Buffalo for the occasion, and even Curtis Powell, whose crucial help had set them on the path to justice and happiness. As Blake slipped a simple gold band onto Rosalie's finger, He marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. "From this day forward," he vowed, his voice steady and sure, "I promise to believe in you always, to stand by your side through whatever challenges we face, and to love you with every breath I take." Rosalie's eyes shimmered with tears as she made her own vows. "I promise to be your partner in all things, to create a home filled with love and trust, and to remind you every day that you are the best decision I ever made." Their first child, a son they named Robert Benjamin O'Malley, was born the following spring, bringing new joy to their lives. 2 years later, a daughter, Elizabeth Sarah, joined the family, her father's eyes and her mother's determined spirit evident from her earliest days. Life on the ranch was not always easy. Drought years tested their resilience, and the harsh Wyoming winters sometimes seemed endless. But through it all, Blake and Rosalie faced every challenge together, their love deepening with each passing season. On their 10th anniversary, as they sat on the porch of their expanded cabin watching their children play in the yard, Blake took Rosalie's hand in his. "You ever regret it?" he asked softly. "Staying here with me instead of returning to the life you knew?" Rosalie leaned against his shoulder, her face illuminated by the golden light of the setting sun. "Not for a single moment," she answered truthfully. "You believed in me when the whole world was against me, Blake. You risked everything to help a stranger hiding in your shed. How could I possibly regret choosing a life with someone capable of such courage and kindness?" Blake pressed a kiss to her temple, his heart full to bursting with gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought this extraordinary woman into his life. "I'm the fortunate one," he murmured. "You gave me a second chance at happiness when I thought those days were behind me." As twilight settled over the land they had nurtured together, Blake and Rosalie O'Malley watched their children's laughter rise into the evening air, a testament to the love that had grown from the unlikeliest of beginnings. A frightened woman hiding from injustice, and a solitary rancher who chose to believe her when no one else would. In the end, that simple act of faith had given them both exactly what they needed most: a true partner, a loving family, and a home where trust and understanding formed the foundation of every day they shared. And as the stars began to appear in the vast Wyoming sky, they knew with absolute certainty that they had found their own perfect version of happily ever after.